I chose to begin this little talk on alternative fingerings with that little snippet from the second movement of the Saint-Saëns clarinet sonata because you have to do something really rather particular there. It's to do with the technical limitations of the instrument, the fact that we don't really have enough alternative fingerings actually. But what I'd like to talk about first of all then really is changing fingers on a note. To do that Saint-Saëns, we have to very rather quickly change fingerings during that note. Because of having to go from a D sharp, C sharp to a G sharp, you can't jump there because it's legato, so we have to change fingerings on that particular note. So I'm going to begin by showing you how to go from right to left on a B whilst continuing the note. And eventually you just get a little bit quicker. And you can do it with a C, C sharp as well. It takes quite a lot of coordination to get it so that you know that the note is continuous as you're changing fingers. But that's a very good exercise, and ultimately will allow you to do that change in the Saint-Saëns. And where you can see very quickly I change fingers during that crochet on the C sharp. There's also a similar idea in the Finzi bagatelles. You remember this bit. There's a lot longer actually to change on that C, and we have to go to a left-hand C because of the E flat, unless of course you have an alternative E flat key there, in which case there are other ways of doing it, but most clarinets don't. And then you change on the long C. I like changing on the beat, but you can change wherever you like. There are also examples in the Brahms First Sonata, in the middle section of the first movement. The Weber Grandeur has examples. There are quite a number of examples of that particular technique. So knowing your alternative fingerings and being able to change as appropriate to enable these passages to be played with a good legato. Of course, as a developing clarinetist, we know the different alternative fingerings that are possible. Obviously, the bell notes in both registers. Some instruments will have the alternative E flat key on the left-hand side. As a matter of fact, I have one on this clarinet, but I took it off. I prefer not to have it there. I find it actually gets in the way, but many people love that alternative E flat, and it can be very useful. And obviously we know how the alternative fingerings work, and we use them as appropriate. And it's important, of course, to write down left or right in your music to remind you if there's a particular route possible or necessary. Just a little personal experience. Many of you will know that I had cancer a few years ago, and one of the side effects is getting very faint. And I managed in the whole time I was having my chemotherapy never to faint, except once. I just fainted once in the bathroom and injured that little finger. Quite severely actually, the way that I obviously fell down, and eventually I had to go to a plastic surgeon, and because the tenon was pulled from this bone, and I absolutely could not control that finger at all. It was all over the place, and they suggested either to remove a tenon from my foot into the finger. That might have worked, or to do this exercise about 450 times a day. Well, actually I was on for that, of course. I did about 1,000 times a day, and eventually, because of other bits of muscle and tendons and ligaments, I got full use of that finger. But for quite a while I was having to work other ways round the instrument because that finger would not go to where I wanted it to. It still is not 100%. So I've organised all sorts of other kind of fingerings to negotiate going across the break and finding ways around the bell notes. And so that was quite interesting for me, in fact, and certainly gave me a lot of thought about those particular alternative fingerings. And when you're practicing your scales, of course, it's the ideal time to work it out and which way you're going around the instrument. I'd like to just chat a little bit about this lovely little book. I don't know whether you've got a copy, 303 Clarinet Fingerings. And when it comes to alternative fingerings, you will be quite amazed what you find here. Alan Sim. I met Alan actually as well at some point, and a lovely chap and absolutely fascinated by alternative fingerings, as you can understand, and having put this little book together. Incidentally, but before I do talk about this, my brain with tenons and tendons, when I was talking about tenons, of course I meant tendons in that last little clip. Anyway, alternative fingerings, of course there are endless alternative fingerings if you start exploring the instrument, and this book is just an absolute goldmine. One thing I haven't talked about yet is of course the long fingerings. The long fingering, for example, E flat, low E flat and B flat. First finger of each hand, or first finger and second finger, first finger and third finger. They all work because it's just a case of closing down this ring system which closes those two because of the correspondence. Clever part of clarinet design. And in the upper register, and there's all sorts of uses. B flat major is a great key for using the long B flat in that particular instance. But there's lots of other, and this book, as I say, is a goldmine of fingerings. F sharp in the second register, we all know the middle finger. We probably know the cross key fingering. I wonder whether you know this particular fingering. So the three fingerings, the left hand, third finger and the E flat key. So for example, that would be very useful. D sharp to F sharp, particularly if they came quickly or as a sort of tremolando. So we've got D sharp to F sharp, which is very easy. Much more tricky to do it like that. That seems to be a much more solid and easy fingering to do. And this book has just got literally 303, hundreds of these interesting fingerings. We could go talking about this for ages, but let me just show you one other that I like. C3, thumb C. If you want a beautiful, soft C3, try covering these three fingers of the left hand. You can get a really beautifully soft C by adding those fingers, and it doesn't change the intonation at all. So an absolute fund of fingerings here. For the most unexpected notes, you suddenly find that there are 3 or 4 or even more, 20 fingerings sometimes for some of these notes. And it's just a wealth of interesting material, and it makes us become even more creative about our fingering. I'd like to say a few words about resonant fingerings, particularly in the throat note area. In a sense, are they alternative fingerings? They're not really alternative fingerings, but they are different fingerings, just compared to playing the A with just opening the A key. And what I'm meaning here is adding extra fingers. And of course, every instrument is slightly different in the way it responds, and you need to just find out what works for you. So some instruments, there will be some implication with the intonation, others not. And of course, it really depends on where you're coming from, where you're going to. But if I play you that A and show you some other fingerings, you'll hear the difference in the resonance and the sound. Everyone has got a slightly different tone quality, some better than others. Some might well match with what comes before, what comes after. B flat. This is actually my favourite fingering for B flat. Great B flat, so B flat, and then everything else I've got 2 and 3 there, and the C sharp key, all the right hand fingers, and the low F key. and with some oral cavity, open oral cavity as well, an oar shape and all that, you get really a nice quality of sound for that note, which is famous for being a difficult note to make a nice sound on. Of course, once you get into the altissimo register, there are literally, well, I won't say hundreds of fingerings, but there are many fingerings. And it's useful to know as many as possible because different fingerings will work better in different contexts. It's interesting to know the overblown throat note fingerings. That's an A. It's kind of like an E flat. If you're going to use overblown throat fingerings, you need to know what notes they're actually going to give you. And sometimes they're useful. There's in the Weber quintet, I can't remember which one it is, but there is definitely a note in the overblown register that I used a lot in the performance of that not that long ago. So let's just take one or two notes. F, for example, there's the long F. There's a short F. Has a different feel and a different kind of sound, but I think they're both pretty much in tune. There's also overblowing D in the low register, which some people like a lot. So I'm just literally playing the low register D fingering and getting that F. Some people I know like using that for the first note of the Weber second concerto. It's quite a strong note. You can blow quite hard and it'll come out loud and clear. E flat just below that is another note. We've got that fingering with the cross key. That fingering, which of course is the one to go to in the opening of the Brahms First Sonata. Middle finger and the E flat key. They all work really rather nicely, and it depends a little bit on the context. And there are many others. And of course, it's useful to know all these fingerings. Another finger just coming to my mind for that F uses the second the second trill key here. If you want to go from that A flat to the F. And that's a very useful fingering. Then that particular group of notes comes in the Poulenc Sonata. So know your instrument and know all these alternative fingerings. You will have heard, of course, of the great clarinetist Gervais de Payer, and I knew him late in his life, and I remember taking a pupil to have a lesson with him, and he has this wonderful concept about fingerings, that anything works if it works. We learn a fingering in our tutor book early on. And that's the fingering for C, but in fact there may be a lot of fingerings, and depending on the resonance, the sound that you want, the context in the music, the note that comes before, I'd like you to be quite imaginative and indeed creative about fingerings, because there are many possibilities. So I hope you've enjoyed that little look at the world of alternative fingerings.